For this lecture today, we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit from the Native Americans and the Great Plains, and we're going to begin to go back to the cities. If you remember, originally we were studying industrialization, a lot of the issues that industrialization caused, how bad the cities got, how bad the factory systems were. This is going to focus on government. So at the same time that the factories were overloaded, the living situations were overloaded, the government was also overloaded, and the systems that people rely on to kind of survive, like fire, police, the welfare systems, in the cities, those are not working. All the city services are completely overloaded. So the objectives today is to look at the leadership and the corruption mostly that broke out in politics throughout the 1870s to the 1890s. And then we're going to talk about how it was reformed. Civil service just means like serving in the government. A civil service person is anybody from like a government elected official all the way down technically through a teacher. So our vocab today, we have the spoils system. This is going to be the most important one that you're going to have to remember. The spoils system is the practice of giving to your political supporters jobs. Instead of them being qualified for it, it was usually based on if they supported you enough. It comes from the phrase, to the winner goes the spoils. So whoever wins gets the loot at the end of the war. They kind of politicians viewed their elections as the same way. If they won, they would hand out jobs to people who had supported them so they could continue to rely on their support. Political machines, these are the ones that give out those spoils. They are a political party's organization that wins loyalty of voters through usually giving things away, and they're usually very corrupt. We'll go over them a little bit. This is civil service is government, and they're non-elected employees. So I correct myself from earlier. The civil service is anybody who's appointed by the government to do a job. They're not elected to it. And then Tammany Hall is going to be a political machine that existed in New York. It was under the Democratic Party, and it was probably the most powerful and the most well-known of the political machines and practiced the spoils system a lot. So the Gilded Age had a lot of corruption, and it kind of forms out of the Civil War. So we went over Reconstruction a little bit. It's that post-Civil War period where the South was rebuilt. But between 1877, so at the end of Reconstruction, all the way up to the 1900s, there's little reform in the U.S. economic systems, the U.S. social systems, political systems, and that leads to what we call the Gilded Age. So if you remember when we talked about gilded, it's like cheap jewelry where underneath it is like tin or iron, and then it's coated in a little bit of gold. So it's like cheap. It's rotten to the core. And that's what people say this time period between 1877 to 1900 is. It's gilded. Everything looks like it's doing really well on the outside. People are happy. The United States is a very powerful nation. There's lots of money going around. But underneath it, there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of rot. There's a lot of racial tensions. And the nation really isn't doing that well. The first kind of major issue with this Gilded Age is the Credit Mobilier scandal. And this is a railroad scandal where the Congress and the Vice President of the United States actually took bribes from a railroad company to allow the railroad company to build. And while it doesn't seem like a big deal, it demonstrates the idea that, public officials are essentially up for sale, and they can be used to get what you want if you're a major corporation. The Compromise of 1877 is something you should star. It's probably one of the most important things in American history that you have never heard of, and it also represents the Gilded Age very well. Under the Compromise of 1877, there was an agreement struck between Democrats in the South and Republicans in the North that Rutherford B. Hayes would be elected president. The reason for this was the election was so close that Congress had to decide it, and they had to get votes from Southern Democrats to support it. So the U.S. military leaves the South, and this ends Reconstruction in the South. So you can change occupation if you want to Reconstruction, but this ends Reconstruction and all the protections that had been given to African Americans. This allows those Redeemer governments that we learned about in 1 and 2, those Southern politicians, mostly former Confederate Democrats, to take control of the South again. And then they begin to, put in Jim Crow. They begin to do the poll taxes and all those things. In exchange, the Republicans get Rutherford B. Hayes elected president. This kind of demonstrates the Gilded Age because it shows that the government is making deals not based on what people voted for, but based on politics and which party can be in power. You can see down here, this cartoon is supposed to demonstrate the Compromise of 1877. You can see the KKK and the White League, who they were kind of like the KKK. They died out. They are kind of holding hands over a black couple, and it says "worse than slavery" above them. So this kind of says that the Compromise of 1877 sold the black Southerners down the river, and essentially now the KKK and the White League have total control over the South. So this picture is kind of the same as that one we saw from before. What it's saying about the Compromise of 1877, it has a Union soldier who's, lost his leg, he's on a crutch, and I assume this is like a wife of a soldier who died, shaking hands with a Southern Confederate over the grave of the Civil War, showing that it really wasn't fought for any reason. Then you have an African American family back here kind of being returned to slavery in the South, showing that nothing really changed. The same people who ruled the South before are the same people who rule the South now. So going from the country to the cities were overloaded, like we said, and there was not enough housing to go around. There weren't enough city services. There wasn't sewage service. There wasn't police. So that leaves a lot of room for the political machines to begin coming in and using city services to get votes. So the political machines would hand out things like jobs, housing, solutions to problems, if you needed your road paved, in exchange for votes. This shows the power of the immigrant voters because these immigrants need these things in their cities, in their neighborhoods. And a politician would come to them and say, hey, we're going to put in a new fire station, but remember who put it in, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And on election day, make sure you vote for us. They would give, jobs to people who had a lot of poll votes. So they would appoint a sheriff to somebody who was very respected in the community so that then they could get the votes from those voters. A lot of the contracts to build roads, to build sewer systems, to build city buildings were given out based on bribes and kickbacks. So it shows more corruption. It's not about doing the best for the people in the city. It's about power and money. The person who kind of personifies this is Boss Tweed right here from Tammany Hall. He was a ultra corrupt Democratic politician during this time period who pretty much held New York in his iron fist by the spoil system and giving out things to political allies. So the spoil system, like I said, is how they did this. And it comes from that idea of to the victor go the spoils of war. Whoever wins the election gives jobs out to people who supported them. And this is done at all levels of government during this time period. Local is probably the easiest one to spot, but it's also done at the federal level. So if a person supported a, local mayor during his campaign, that person may become, the director of transportation in that town, even though they have no experience with transportation because they're an ally of that mayor now. So you can see here, this shows a local mayor throwing out appointments to different people based on if they supported him or not. And they're all trying to get him, so they're going to continue to support that person as long as they're in office. This did not mean that it was kind of just accepted by people. A lot of people wanted to get rid of this idea of the spoil system. They wanted honest government. And it started with the Pendleton Civil Service Act. So President Garfield was actually assassinated by a disgruntled job seeker who didn't get a job in the federal government through the spoil system. So he decided to shoot the president. And it showed how bad the spoil system was. So the reaction was to pass the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which created an exam, which you still have to take today, to show you're qualified for the job. So you don't just get random appointees. You get people who actually know about sewer systems to run the sewage. You get a person who knows about law enforcement to be the sheriff. And the idea is it gives people who are experienced in their job, people who are actually qualified for their job, the ability to run that department, and it should improve the cities. This is a major blow to the spoil system because now people have to actually begin thinking about appointees who can do the job instead of just their best friend who supported them during the election. Another way to kind of combat the corruption during the Gilded Age was newspapers. So during this time period, pretty much everybody got all their news from newspapers. But in the cities, a lot of the new immigrants couldn't read and couldn't write. So it's difficult to obviously read a newspaper. So political cartoons like this one down here, they became the main way that information was spread about these corrupt politicians, especially at the local small level. Thomas Nast over here was probably the most famous. He pretty much brought down Boss Tweed because he published these cartoons. This is Boss Tweed here where the mouse is, where he made Boss Tweed just seem like this gross, fat, corrupt old man. And he showed the issues that were coming out of Tammany Hall and with Boss Tweed's leadership. This is going to be what you're going to do for an assignment. You're going to look at the different cartoons, a lot of them from Thomas Nast, and show how they have kind of pieces of the Gilded Age with them. These cartoons would really, get immigrant voters to see that their votes were essentially being bought and would have them vote these people out of office so that better politicians and more honest politicians could eventually be elected. So this cartoon kind of demonstrates Thomas Nast's ideas and how he spread his message. It shows Boss Tweed trying to be stuffed into the city's jail, but it says no prison is big enough to hold the boss. So you can kind of get from this that Boss Tweed controls the prisons. He's too big. You can't throw him in jail. But as a illiterate immigrant, if you could read just a little bit, or you could have somebody tell you what this means, you could get the meaning of this cartoon, and you generally start to kind of turn against Boss Tweed. So I'd like you to think about this quote from Mark Twain. It says, "The golden gleam of the gilded surface hides the cheapness of the metal underneath." This kind of summarizes the Gilded Age, and when we come back to next class, I'd like to go over this. But remember, the Gilded Age is all about corruption. Everything looks nice, but underneath, it's not going well, and it's very, very cheap. So I hope this helped you understand the Gilded Age a little bit, and if you have any questions, please let me know.